Okay, let's unpack this. Sacrifice. It's a concept that feels woven into the very fabric of human experience, doesn't it?
It really does, yeah.
From these, grand historical rituals that might make us a bit uneasy today,
Mm-hmm.
to those quiet personal choices we make every single day maybe, like skipping your morning coffee to get to a meeting on time or staying up late to help someone out.
Right. Small things, big things.
It feels like it's more than just giving something up. It seems to carry a certain weight. And you shared some really fascinating material with us, drawing from, well, everything: anthropology, sociology, psychology.
Philosophy, religious studies, even evolutionary biology and history. It's a wide net.
Exactly. So our mission today really is to delve into these sources and try to get a deeper understanding of this pervasive, often really complex part of being human.
And it's interesting, that even the word sacrifice itself has this kind of double meaning embedded right in it.
Oh yeah, how so?
Well, it comes from the Latin sacrificium, which originally meant making sacred.
Making sacred, okay.
So in its earliest sense, it was really about elevating something, setting it apart for, the divine.
Right.
But the way we often understand it now is much more about the act of loss, the giving up of something we actually value.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that tension, that sort of inherent tension between making something sacred and experiencing a loss, that's really a key thing we need to keep in mind as we explore this whole topic.
Absolutely. And that tension, it seems to play out across so many different areas, right? We're looking at the really visceral historical practices, human and animal sacrifices, offerings of, material goods.
The tangible stuff.
And then these more internal sort of intangible sacrifices we make with our time, our ambitions, even aspects of ourselves.
Yeah. So what we want to understand isn't just what these sacrifices are, but the underlying motivations, the functions they serve.
And maybe whether this is in some way just an inescapable part of the human experience.
Exactly. That's the big question, I think. So where should we start? Maybe with those more tangible forms, the offerings of life and matter.
Yeah, let's do that. Looking back through history, one of the most striking forms is undoubtedly human sacrifice.
Definitely. It's the ritual offering of a human life, typically directed towards some kind of deity.
And the reasons behind it were just incredibly varied, weren't they?
Hugely varied. But across these diverse cultures, you see this recurring theme. Sacrifice, especially the ultimate offering of a human life, was often seen as the most potent way to directly influence the forces they believed governed their world.
Like appeasing angry gods or ensuring things like fertility.
Exactly. Appeasing gods, ensuring fertility, securing victory in war, even consecrating important buildings, providing servants for the afterlife, or sometimes for divination purposes.
Wow.
The perceived power in offering a human life was just immense. It really highlights this profound belief in a direct, almost transactional relationship with the supernatural.
It really can be quite intense when you look at the specifics. Take the Aztecs, for example. Their whole cosmology seemed tied to this idea, right? That the sun god needed human hearts and blood.
Yeah, to keep the sun moving across the sky, to nourish it.
And the scale,
Eh.
it's almost unimaginable. Reports of tens of thousands during the reconsecration of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan.
It's staggering. And the practice of heart removal. Very specific, very ritualized.
And the Mayans, they also practiced human sacrifice, didn't they? Often with prisoners?
Yes, often prisoners on special occasions, sometimes in temples or famously in those natural sinkholes, the cenotes.
Like Chichen Itza, I've heard about that.
Exactly. The one at Chichen Itza is a famous example. There are accounts suggesting some victims were painted blue as an offering to Chak, the rain god.
And was there some debated link to their ball games?
There is, yeah. The exact nature of that link is still debated among scholars, but there seems to be some connection.
It's fascinating, too, how culturally specific these practices could be.
Absolutely. The Inca, for instance, practiced child sacrifice, which was called capacocha.
Child sacrifice, wow.
Yes, usually on really significant occasions, like a new ruler taking power or trying to avert a major natural disaster.
Why children?
They were often seen as pure, the best offering, and the practice involved taking them to high mountain peaks, often after giving them drugs to sedate them and leaving them there as offerings.
That's quite chilling.
It is. And then you look at ancient China. During the Shang dynasty, human sacrifice was surprisingly widespread for both religious and political reasons.
Involving who?
Men, women, even children. Archaeology shows things like pit sacrifices, foundation sacrifices where children were killed and buried under buildings.
Good grief. To protect the building.
Apparently, yeah. To ensure stability, consecrate it. And also retainer sacrifice, burying servants or companions with rulers.
Like we see elsewhere, too.
Exactly. It's interesting, though, in China, this practice seems to have declined quite significantly after the country was unified.
So it shows these things could change within a culture over time.
Definitely. Even in ancient Egypt, in the very early periods, they practiced retainer sacrifice. Servants buried with pharaohs like Jijur and Aha.
But that changed later.
Yes. Later, it was replaced by the use of symbolic figures, those little ushabti dolls, meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife.
Right.
We see similar patterns in Mesopotamia. The famous Great Death Pit at Ur had attendants buried with rulers. And among the Etruscans, archaeological evidence points to ritual sacrifice, too.
And then there are these historical accounts, though sometimes may be biased, like the Roman accusations against Carthage.
Yes, accusing them of mass infant sacrifice to Baal Hammon. Some sources suggest this might have actually increased during their conflicts with Rome, perhaps out of desperation.
That's a grim thought.
And the Celts. Historical accounts mention sacrifices involving drowning or even divination practices based on the death spasms of victims who were stabbed.
It just underscores the sheer variety of methods used, doesn't it?
It really does. Decapitation, heart extraction, drowning, burning, live burial, the whole spectrum.
And as you mentioned, it seems like over time, many cultures move towards animal sacrifice, or even symbolic offerings instead.
Yes, though it's important to remember it wasn't necessarily a simple linear progression. It was likely a very complex negotiation involving changing beliefs, ethical ideas, resources, maybe external pressures.
Which brings us nicely to animal sacrifice. That seems incredibly widespread too, right? From way back in prehistory up to, well, even today in some places.
Absolutely. The ritual killing of animals as offerings is found almost everywhere, across vast stretches of time.
And the thinking behind it feels a bit different from human sacrifice. More about offering the life force, the blood, maybe.
Often, yes. Rationales include offering that vital force, appeasement, of course, but also things like communion with the divine, often through sharing a meal made from the sacrificed animal. Thanksgiving, expiation for sins, purification rituals, ensuring fertility.
So it's really the act of offering that's key, maybe more than just the destruction.
That's a good way to put it. The focus is often on the offering itself, and the types of animals used, the rituals. Incredibly diverse.
Like what sort of animals?
Pretty much everything imaginable. Domestic animals, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, but also birds, fish, wild game. The choice often depended on the specific deity being worshipped or the purpose of the sacrifice.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The ancient Greeks, for instance, might offer black animals to underworld deities, the chthonic gods, but they might offer bulls to gods associated with fertility, like Zeus or Poseidon.
And the rituals themselves could be quite involved.
Oh, very. Often starting with selecting a perfect, unblemished animal, then maybe decorating it with wreaths, leading it in a procession. There'd be acts of consecration, maybe sprinkling grain or water, specific methods of slaughter, like throat cutting, collecting the blood, often for sprinkling on an altar.
And what happened to the animal afterwards?
That varied too. Sometimes the entire animal was burned a Holocaust offering. Other times, parts were burned for the gods, and the rest was cooked and shared in a communal feast.
Right, that communal aspect again. Correct. We see detailed rules for this in the Hebrew Bible, don't we? Leviticus.
Exactly. Leviticus lays out a very complex system. Voluntary offerings like burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, and mandatory ones like sin and trespass offerings, each requiring specific animals for different situations and purposes.
And the Greeks had different types too.
Yes. The phagia was common for the Olympian gods that involved partial burning and the shared meal. But sacrifices to the chthonic, the underworld deities, often involve complete destruction or burial of the animal. Different relationship, different ritual.
In Vedic India, I know sacrifice was huge there.
Immense. The yajna system was incredibly complex, aimed at maintaining cosmic order. There were daily rituals, seasonal ones, and huge, elaborate sacrifices, like the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice, which was a major royal ritual.
And it's not just ancient history. What about today?
Well, in Islam, during Eid al-Adha, there's the Qurbani. It commemorates Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son and involves the ritual sacrifice of animals like sheep, goats, cows, or camels, with the meat often shared.
Yeah.
And in many African traditional religions, animal sacrifice still plays a really important role in various practices: healing rituals, divination, venerating ancestors.
So moving beyond life offerings, what about just stuff? Material goods.
Yes, material and bloodless offerings. This covers a huge range of things. Plant-based offerings are very common. Grains, fruits, vegetables, often the first fruits of the harvest.
Showing gratitude, maybe. Giving back the first part.
Exactly. That idea of acknowledging divine ownership or provision. Also things like flowers, prepared foods like bread, special drinks like the Vedic soma.
And liquids. Libations.
Yes, libations were very common offerings of milk, honey, water, wine, oil poured out onto the ground or an altar, and then valuable manufactured goods, too.
Like what?
Tools, weapons, jewelry, clothing, pottery, precious metals, figurines, even money in later periods.
So basically anything valuable could be offered.
Pretty much. And the purposes seem similar in many ways to animal sacrifice, just without the life element. Thanksgiving, propitiation, maybe providing sustenance for gods or spirits, consecration of places or items, purification, sometimes even acting as substitutes or ransoms where an animal might have been used previously.
And these weren't necessarily separate. They could be part of bigger ritual.
Oh, absolutely. Material offerings were often integrated into larger ceremonies that might also include animal sacrifice or other elements. Think of the Greek anagasmata, those libations poured for the dead, or the complex Vedic soma rituals.
Or all the stuff found in Egyptian tombs.
Exactly. Massive amounts of material goods intended for the afterlife. Or even going way back, those prehistoric deposits of metalwork, beautiful swords, jewelry found in bogs or wells.
What's the thinking there? Offerings to water gods.
That's a common interpretation, yes. Offerings to water deities, or perhaps disposing of war booty, dedicating it to the gods.
Okay, this next category is really mind-bending. Divine offerings. Gods sacrificing themselves.
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept found in several mythologies. Deities themselves engaging in acts of sacrifice, often in primordial times, to create the world or establish cosmic order.
Like who?
Well, in the Vedic tradition, there's the story of Prajapati, the primordial being, sacrificing himself, and from his dismembered body, the universe is created.
Wow.
And there's a theory by Adolf Jensen about demi-deities, these primordial beings whose violent deaths were believed to have inaugurated human history and the cultivation of crops. Subsequent ritual killings were seen as reenactments of these foundational events.
And the Aztecs had something similar, did they? Linking back to human sacrifice.
Yes, their creation myths told of gods sacrificing themselves to create the world and, crucially, the sun. This narrative then provided a powerful justification for ongoing human sacrifice, the idea that humans needed to repay this divine sacrifice to keep the cosmos running.
And of course, in Christianity, the central idea is the sacrifice of Christ.
Exactly. Christ, as both divine and human, offering himself to atone for human sin. It's a cornerstone of the faith.
And sometimes this even involves symbolically eating the god, the yaphagy.
Yes, that's another related concept. You see it, for example, in Aztec rituals involving the consumption of dough images made in the likeness of the god Huitzilopochtli. And, of course, the Christian Eucharist, the communion rite, is understood by many Christians as a symbolic or even literal partaking of the body and blood of Christ.
Looking back at this whole sweep human, animal, material, divine, that shift you mentioned, it really wasn't just a straight line, was it?
Not at all. It seems much more like a complex negotiation within different societies. The fundamental need or desire for potent offerings interacting with changing ethics, available resources, cultural contacts, political shifts, all sorts of factors.
And you also mentioned the difference between communion sacrifices and Holocaust offerings.
Right. Communion sacrifices often involve sharing the offering, frequently in a meal, which emphasizes social integration, community bonding, and that direct link with the divine.
Shared substance, shared connection.
Exactly. Whereas Holocaust offerings, where the sacrifice is completely destroyed or removed, burned entirely, poured out, buried, often points towards different theological ideas. Maybe gift giving, where the gift is fully transferred to the divine realm, or expiation, where impurity or sin is being removed and destroyed.
So different ways of relating to the sacred implied by the different ritual actions.
Precisely. The form of the sacrifice often reflects the underlying understanding of the divine and the desired outcome.
Okay, so we've spent a good amount of time looking at these tangible forms of sacrifice, the offerings of life, of material goods. But as we touched on earlier, the whole concept extends way beyond these physical acts, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We talk about intangible sacrifices all the time, especially in modern life.
Yeah, maybe even more often.
Quite possibly. Particularly in more secular contexts, we see the significant shift towards the sacrifice of things like time, effort, and opportunity.
Can you unpack that a bit? What falls under that umbrella?
It's about willingly relinquishing valuable non-material assets. Things like your time, your energy, physical comfort, maybe your personal preferences, sometimes even entire life paths or career ambitions.
All in pursuit of some chosen goal or a cause, or maybe for a relationship, or even just an experience you value.
Exactly. It's a much more internalized form of sacrifice, and arguably a much more prevalent one in many contemporary societies.
And you really do see examples everywhere, don't you? Career sacrifices for family is a big one.
Huge. Balancing work and life often involves sacrificing something: time with family, career advancement, maybe financial gain.
Or choosing ethically sourced products, even if they cost more or are harder to find. That's a kind of sacrifice of convenience or money.
It is. Or think about pilgrimages, whether religious or even secular ones, like visiting a historical site that's meaningful to you. They involve significant commitments of time, money, effort, often physical discomfort.
Yeah. Or people doing extreme charity fundraisers, running marathons, climbing mountains, enduring pain and risk for a cause.
Definitely. And even on a smaller daily scale, sacrificing leisure time to study or work late, investing effort in maintaining relationships even when it's difficult, giving up personal preferences to accommodate others.
Choosing to hold your tongue in an argument for the sake of peace, maybe?
That fits too. All these fit within this broader understanding of intangible sacrifice. And what's interesting is that these kinds of sacrifices often seem to go beyond a simple cost-benefit calculation.
How so?
Well, they can be driven by a deep desire to achieve personal meaning, or to demonstrate commitment to something or someone you value highly, or even to experience a sense of transcendence, of going beyond your own immediate needs and desires.
And remembering past sacrifices can actually boost motivation, you're saying?
Research suggests it can. Looking back on what you've already invested or given up can strengthen your resolve to keep going towards that goal.
Okay, so that leads us into self-sacrifice and altruism. These seem related, but maybe have more layers.
They do. They're closely linked but subtly distinct. Self-sacrifice is basically acting in a way that benefits another person or a group, but at some cost to yourself.
Right.
Altruism, technically, refers more to the motivation behind that action, the desire to benefit another person purely for their own sake without expecting anything in return.
So you can have self-sacrifice that isn't purely altruistic, maybe.
Exactly. The two often overlap in practice, of course.
Yeah.
But self-sacrifice can range from really small concessions in daily life,
Like letting someone go ahead of you in line.
right up to extreme actions that could even involve risking or losing your own life. And it's important to try and distinguish these acts from things we do that might look like sacrifices, but are ultimately driven by self-interest, maybe long-term gain.
And the motivations behind why people engage in self-sacrifice or altruism seem incredibly varied, too.
Hugely. You have genuine empathy and care for others, what we might call pure altruism. Then there's the idea of reciprocal altruism.
I'll scratch your back idea.
If you scratch mine. Exactly. The expectation, maybe not even conscious, that helping others now will lead to benefits for you down the line.
And kin selection. Helping relatives.
Yes. That's a powerful evolutionary driver behaviors that benefit our genetic relatives, thus helping our own genes get passed on indirectly.
And costly signaling. Sacrificing is a way to show off good qualities.
Right. The idea that engaging in costly self-sacrificial acts can be a reliable way to signal things like commitment, trustworthiness, or even resources to others.
And then there are more social or moral reasons.
Absolutely. A desire to foster social harmony, a sense of moral duty based on ethical beliefs or religious teachings, or even that deeper search for meaning and transcendence we talked about. And psychology has offered some really useful ways to think about these motivations, especially in relationships.
You mean the approach versus avoidance idea?
Exactly. This distinction seems really important. If you're making a sacrifice in a relationship with the goal of approaching something positive, like enhancing intimacy, making your partner happy, living up to shared values.
That's approach motivated.
Right. And research consistently links that kind of motivation to positive outcomes, better personal well-being, more satisfaction in the relationship, a stronger sense of authenticity, feeling good about the sacrifice.
But if you're sacrificing mainly to avoid something negative,
That's avoidance-motivated sacrifice. So sacrificing to prevent conflict, to avoid guilt, to stop your partner from being angry.
Okay.
That tends to be linked with negative outcomes, things like resentment, instability in the relationship, feeling worse about yourself, lower well-being.
And authenticity is key here, too.
It seems to be. Approach-motivated sacrifice often feels more aligned with your true self, like you're choosing it freely based on your values. Avoidance-motivated sacrifice can feel more like self-suppression, like you're being forced into it or doing it against your will.
But there are real risks, right?
Yeah.
Sacrificing too much.
Absolutely. It's crucial to recognize the potential dangers of chronic or excessive self-sacrifice. It can lead to emotional exhaustion, burnout, persistent resentment, feeling like you've lost your own identity.
And even physical health problems.
Yes, potentially through the effects of chronic stress. If sacrifice becomes a constant pattern without sufficient recovery, appreciation, or positive reciprocity, it can really take a toll.
It feels like a real paradox we live with, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Culturally, we often praise self-sacrifice, hold it up as a virtue.
We do. It's often seen as noble, selfless.
But psychologically, there are these clear warnings about the potential downsides if it's not done in a healthy way.
Exactly. It seems the positive outcomes are strongly tied to sacrifices that are freely chosen, that are motivated by pursuing positive goals, approach, and that feel authentic to the person making them.
Whereas sacrifices that feel coerced or are mainly about avoiding negatives, avoidance, or just become this relentless pattern of self-neglect, those can be quite damaging.
So learning to distinguish between healthy giving and potentially harmful self-abnegation seems really important for well-being.
Okay, so we've explored the what of sacrifice, tangible, intangible. Now let's dig into the why. What are the fundamental functions, the motivations driving this seemingly universal human behavior?
Right. And it's really important to stress up front, this is complex. There's this intricate interplay of sociocultural functions, psychological drivers, maybe even deep evolutionary roots. No single theory is going to cover it all.
So multiple layers working together. Let's start with the sociocultural functions. How does sacrifice help sort of weave the social fabric?
A key aspect seems to be establishing and maintaining relationships, both with the divine, or supernatural forces, and with other people in the society.
Okay, how does that work with the divine?
Well, one influential idea comes from the anthropologist Robertson Smith, who talked about communion. He argued that sharing a sacrificial meal, particularly one where the victim was seen as related to both the god and the worshippers, created this powerful bond through shared substance. The victim was like an intermediary.
Showing food, creating connection. Makes sense.
Then you have the gift exchange theory, associated with thinkers like Tyler, Mauss, and Vanderloo. This sees sacrifice as a form of gift-giving to the gods, often with the expectation of receiving something in return to a dizzy, I give so that you may give.
Like a transaction almost.
In its basic form, yes. The gift was often thought to carry some essence of the giver, creating an obligation for the receiver. Though this could evolve over time into more symbolic acts of homage or self-denial without a direct expectation of return.
And what about relationships between people? How does sacrifice strengthen social bonds?
This is where someone like Emil Durkheim comes in. He really emphasized the role of collective rituals, including sacrifice, in reinforcing social solidarity.
Like bringing everyone together?
Exactly. Participating together in these often emotionally charged rituals reaffirms shared values, strengthens the sense of belonging, reinforces group identity. It helps maintain the cohesion of the group.
So it serves a bonding function. What about maintaining order, both cosmic and social?
That's another major set of functions. Appeasement and propitiation are common, basically, trying to placate deities who are perceived as angry or potentially harmful to ward off disasters or misfortune.
Trying to keep the cosmic balance.
Right. And then there's expiation and atonement, making amends for wrongdoing, for transgressions, for ritual pollution, in order to restore harmony. This is central in traditions like the Hebrew Bible's sacrificial system or the Christian understanding of Christ's sacrifice.
Okay. And how does it relate to social order, like hierarchies?
Sacrifice can definitely function to reinforce existing power structures. Often it was the rulers, the priests, the elites who controlled or performed the most important sacrificial rituals.
Showing they had a special connection to the gods.
Precisely. It demonstrated their divine favor, their ability to mediate with the sacred, which helped legitimize their status and authority. Even the specific type of offering made, or the portion of the sacrifice someone received, could signify their social standing.
Interesting. And wasn't there a theory about sacrifice and violence? Scapegoating.
Yes, that's René Girard's influential theory. He argued that societies build up internal tensions and rivalries, what he called mimetic desire, which can lead to escalating violence.
Okay.
Sacrifice, in his view, particularly the ritual killing of a scapegoat victim, serves to channel all that collective aggression onto a single point. It provides a catharsis and prevents the violence from tearing the whole community apart. The victim, paradoxically, becomes sacred through this process.
Wow, that's a powerful idea. And finally, maintaining cosmic order more broadly, like ensuring harvests.
Yes, ensuring the continuation of natural cycles. We saw that with the Aztecs needing to nourish the sun, promoting fertility of land, animals, and people. Sir James Frazer wrote about the idea of ritually killing a divine king to ensure the rejuvenation of the land's fertility. And Jensen's theory about reenacting the killing of primordial Dema deities also fits here, repeating the foundational act to keep the world going.
And sacrifice also seems important for marking transitions, right?
Yeah.
Like rites of passage.
Definitely. Sacrificial elements are often found in rites of passage ceremonies marking birth, puberty, marriage, death. They help individuals navigate these major life changes and integrate into their new roles or statuses within the community.
And those foundation sacrifices you mentioned earlier.
Yes, offerings made during the construction of buildings or the founding of settlements, historically sometimes human or animal, later often symbolic objects. The idea was to consecrate the space, ensure its stability, protect it from harm.
And what about death rituals? Mortuary sacrifices.
Offerings made to honor the dead, perhaps provide for them in the afterlife or maintain a relationship with ancestors. And retainer sacrifice, which we discussed burying servants, wives, warriors with a deceased leader, was about ensuring their status and service continued in the next world.
What strikes me looking at all these functions is how interconnected they seem. One ritual could do many things at once.
Exactly right. A harvest festival, for example, isn't just about Thanksgiving. It might also be about communion with a deity, ensuring future fertility, reinforcing community bonds, maybe even reminding people of the social hierarchy through how the feast is shared.
So it's not like sacrifice has just one single purpose?
No, it seems much more like an incredibly flexible and adaptable, symbolic and social tool. A technology, almost, that societies have used to address a whole range of interconnected needs and anxieties. Multifunctional.
Okay, so those are the sociocultural angles. What about the inner world? The psychological and cognitive drivers.
Right. Shifting focus to the individual level. Intrinsic motivations, what drives us from within, and the search for personal meaning are really significant here.
Like that approach versus avoidance distinction again.
Yes, particularly in interpersonal sacrifice. As we said, sacrificing with approach goals, aiming for positive outcomes like intimacy, shared joy, living up to values tends to feel better and lead to better results for well-being and relationships.
Whereas avoidance goals trying to prevent conflict or guilt often backfire.
They often do, leading to resentment and lower satisfaction. And that feeling of authenticity, acting in line with your true self, seems crucial. Approach goals tend to foster that feeling, while avoidance goals can feel like you're suppressing who you are.
And sacrifice can be a way to make meaning, especially in difficult times.
Absolutely. It can be a powerful tool for constructing purpose, for connecting our actions to something we see as larger or more important than our immediate selves. It can help make sense of suffering or hardship endured for a cause or a loved one. It can even be seen as part of personal development, letting go of ego, fostering reconciliation, deepening spiritual connection.
And what about how our brains are wired? Do cognitive biases play a role?
They certainly seem to. There's the martyrdom effect or effort justification. This is the tendency to value things more highly if we've had to work hard or suffer for them.
So the difficulty of the sacrifice can actually increase its perceived value or our motivation.
In some contexts, yes, particularly pro-social ones. The effort signals commitment both to ourselves and others and makes the goal seem more worthwhile.
But that sounds like it could lead us astray too.
It can. Related to this is the sunk cost fallacy. This is where we continue to invest time, effort, or resources into something, maybe a sacrificial pattern of behavior, simply because we've already invested so much, even if it's no longer rational or beneficial. We don't want to feel like our past sacrifices were wasted.
Right. Throwing good money after bad, essentially.
Kind of like that, yeah. And some researchers even propose a basic cognitive bias hypothesis, suggesting that maybe some extreme self-sacrifice, especially outside immediate life or death situations, might be driven more by these kinds of biases, overvaluing effort, getting trapped by sunk costs, rather than being purely adaptive evolutionary strategies.
Interesting. And what about our identity, our connection to groups?
Hugely important. One key concept here is identity fusion. This is a profound feeling of oneness with a group, where the boundaries between personal identity and group identity become porous.
How does that happen?
It's often forged through shared intense experiences, sometimes positive but often stressful or aversive ones. Think soldiers in combat, members of intensely devoted religious groups, even fans of sports teams going through major highs and lows together.
And this fusion motivates sacrifice.
Very strongly. If you feel fused with a group, threats to the group feel like personal threats. You're much more willing to make significant, even extreme sacrifices for the group's well-being or survival because its fate feels like your own.
And even without that intense fusion, sacrifice signals commitment to a group.
Yes, engaging in costly or public sacrifices, things that are hard to fake, serves as a powerful signal to others in the group that you are truly committed. This builds trust, facilitates cooperation, strengthens your sense of belonging, and solidifies the group itself.
Okay, so we have these social functions, these psychological drivers.
Yeah.
But what about the really deep history, the evolutionary perspective? How could natural selection possibly favor sacrificing oneself?
That's the fundamental question evolutionary theories try to address. One major explanation is kin selection, based on W.D. Hamilton's work.
This is about helping relatives, right?
Exactly. The core idea is that natural selection can favor altruistic behaviors, actions that cost the actor, but benefit the recipient if the recipient is a genetic relative. The key is Hamilton's rule. Altruism is favored if RBC.
Can you break that down? RBC.
Sure. C is the cost to the altruist, the one making the sacrifice. B is the benefit to the recipient. And R is the coefficient of relatedness, how closely related they are genetically, e.g. 0.5 for parents' offspring and full siblings, 0.25 for grandparents' grandchildren, 0.125 for cousins.
So if the benefit to your relative, weighted by how related you are, is greater than the cost to you, the behavior can spread.
That's the idea. It's about inclusive fitness, the total reproductive success, both your own direct fitness and the success you help your relatives achieve, indirect fitness. This helps explain things like parental care, siblings helping each other, sacrifices made for family.
But it requires knowing who your relatives are, presumably.
Yes, it generally requires some mechanism for kin recognition or situations where individuals in a group are likely to be related anyway, like viscous populations where individuals don't move far from where they were born.
Okay, so kin selection explains sacrifice for relatives.
Yeah.
What about sacrificing for non-relatives, friends, strangers?
That's where reciprocal altruism comes in, a theory developed primarily by Robert Travers. This suggests that cooperation and sacrifice among unrelated individuals can evolve if there's a high probability that the help given now will be repaid later.
The you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours idea again.
Exactly. The immediate cost of helping someone must be less than the benefit you expect to receive when they reciprocate in the future.
What's needed for this to work?
Several things. Individuals need to be able to recognize each other and remember past interactions, who helped whom, who cheated. You generally need relatively stable social groups where individuals interact repeatedly over time. And crucially, there need to be mechanisms to detect and punish or exclude cheaters, those who take the benefits without reciprocating.
So it keeps the system honest.
Ideally, yes. Reciprocal altruism is thought to be a major foundation for human cooperation, sharing food, mutual defense, forming alliances. It might even be the evolutionary root of emotions like gratitude, sympathy, trust, guilt when we fail to reciprocate, and moralistic aggression, anger towards cheaters.
It's almost like enlightened self-interest for our genes.
That's a good way to think about it. From the gene's perspective, helping someone else now, even at a cost, can be beneficial if it increases the chances of receiving greater help later. But for it to be stable, cooperators need to mostly interact with other cooperators, what's called assortment.
Okay. And the third evolutionary idea was costly signaling.
Right. Costly signaling theory, drawing from Amatsa Javi's work initially on animal signals and later applied to humans by researchers like William Irons. The core idea is that behaviors that are costly, hard to perform, risky, resource-intensive, can function as honest signals of underlying positive qualities.
Why costly?
Because the cost ensures the signal's reliability. It's hard or impossible for individuals who don't possess the quality to fake the signal convincingly. Think of a peacock's tail. It's costly to grow and maintain, making it an honest signal of health and genetic quality.
So how does this apply to sacrifice?
Sacrificial acts, especially those that are public, difficult, or involve giving up valuable resources, can serve as potent, honest signals.
Similarly what?
A range of things depending on the context. Commitment to a group or a religious belief. Think enduring painful rituals or adhering to strict taboos. Pro-social tendencies like generosity or willingness to cooperate, sharing resources after a successful hunt. Skills or prowess, braving danger in hunting. Devotion or spiritual power, ascetic practices enduring ecstatic states. Even signaling need like displays of illness or distress that elicit support from others.
And what's a benefit to the signaler?
By honestly advertising these positive qualities, they can enhance their reputation, build trust, attract mates or allies, gain social status, and ultimately facilitate cooperation that benefits them in the long run.
It really highlights how these different levels, sociocultural, psychological, evolutionary, aren't separate boxes, are they? They all seem to interact.
Absolutely, they're complementary perspectives. Evolutionary theories provide the ultimate explanations, the deep historical reasons why these tendencies might have evolved. Psychological mechanisms provide the proximate explanations, the immediate mental processes and motivations that cause the behavior in the here and now.
Can you give an example?
Sure. You feel empathy, a proximate psychological mechanism, and help a friend move house, a sacrificial act. The ultimate evolutionary explanation might be rooted in reciprocal altruism. That tendency evolved because mutual helping benefited our ancestors. Or participating in a difficult, painful initiation ritual, proximate factors might be identity fusion, effort justification, could function as a costly signal of commitment that strengthens group cooperation, ultimate evolutionary benefit. Understanding the interaction is key.
So just to quickly recap the main theories we've touched on: gift theory, communion theory, social cohesion, modification of condition, rejuvenation, scapegoating.
Right, those cover many of the major sociocultural and anthropological perspectives.
And the psychological ones focusing on motivation, meaning biases.
And the evolutionary angles. Kin selection, reciprocal altruism, and costly signaling.
It's a lot to keep track of. And obviously these are simplified summaries with lots of overlap in debate.
Definitely. But it gives a sense of the different ways scholars have tried to make sense of this complex behavior.
Now, this next part feels like a bit of a left turn, but maybe an interesting one. Looking at sacrifice through really abstract frameworks: logic, math, even physics.
Yeah, and it's really important to preface this by saying these are primarily tools for modeling certain aspects or for drawing conceptual analogies. They aren't intended as literal explanations of sacrifice itself.
Okay, understood. So how can things like decision theory or game theory help model sacrificial choices?
Well, decision theory looks at how individuals make choices, often under conditions of uncertainty or risk. Sacrifice often fits this pattern. You choose a known cost, giving something up now, for an uncertain or future benefit. Concepts from decision theory, like prospect theory, how we evaluate potential losses and gains relative to a starting point, or multi-attribute utility theory, how we make trade-offs between different desirable things, can be used to model the calculations someone might, perhaps unconsciously, make when deciding whether to sacrifice.
And game theory. That seems relevant for the social side.
Very relevant. Game theory analyzes strategic interactions, where the outcome for one person depends on the choices of others as well. This is crucial for understanding cooperation and sacrifice in social contexts.
Like the prisoner's dilemma we mentioned.
Exactly. That classic game perfectly illustrates the tension between individual rationality, defecting or not sacrificing, and collective rationality, cooperating, which involves mutual sacrifice of immediate self-interest.
But in repeated games, cooperation can emerge.
Yes. In iterated versions of the prisoner's dilemma, strategies based on reciprocity, like tit for tat, cooperate initially, then mirror the opponent's last move, can be surprisingly stable and successful. This shows how mutual sacrifice, based on reciprocity, can be sustained over time.
Can game theory model the perception of sacrifice?
Some more sophisticated models try to. They incorporate how the perceived cost incurred by the giver influences the recipient's response, which gets closer to real human reciprocity. We often respond more strongly when we know someone made a big sacrifice for us. There are also models exploring leadership as a strategic investment, where leaders might make calculated sacrifices to build trust and effectiveness.
But these models have limits, right? People aren't always perfectly rational calculators.
Absolutely. That's the main limitation. Game theory models often assume perfect rationality, complete information, clear payoffs. Real human behavior is messy, influenced by emotions, norms, values, biases, and they often struggle to explain how cooperation gets started in the first place.
Okay, what about logic? How does that help us understand sacrifice?
Logic provides tools to examine the reasoning behind sacrifice, the justifications people offer, and also to analyze inherent paradoxes within the concept itself.
So checking if the arguments make sense.
Essentially, yes. Justifications for sacrifice often take the form. Sacrificing X, this valuable thing, is necessary to achieve Y, this greater value or goal. Logic helps us assess if the inference is valid and if the premises are true. A lot of justifications might turn out to be logically flawed on closer inspection.
And what about paradoxes?
Sacrifice seems rife with potential paradoxes. There's the basic paradox of altruism we touched on. If rationality means maximizing self-interest, how can sacrificing your own well-being for others ever be logical? This connects to deep ethical debates.
Right.
Then there's a more technical philosophical puzzle, sometimes called the paradox of self-release and obligation. If you owe a duty to someone else, they can usually release you from that duty. But if you supposedly owe a duty to yourself, for example, a duty of self-care or self-respect, can you release yourself from that duty? If you can, is it really a binding duty at all?
I see the problem. How is that relevant to sacrifice?
It becomes relevant when we think about ethical limits on self-sacrifice. If we have coherent, binding duties to ourselves, perhaps related to self-preservation, dignity, or personal development, then those duties could provide a logical basis for arguing that some forms or degrees of self-sacrifice are actually wrong or impermissible.
So logic can help define the boundaries.
It can help clarify the arguments around those boundaries. And sometimes what looks like a deep paradox might just be a result of unclear language or flawed assumptions. Like Ayn Rand defining sacrifice as always giving up a higher value for a lower one. That definition makes it inherently irrational by design, which isn't so much a paradox as a definitional stance.
Okay, and finally, physics. How on earth does physics relate to sacrifice? Sounds like a stretch.
It's definitely about conceptual metaphors, not literal explanations, just using ideas from physics as illustrative tools.
Okay, like what?
Well, think about energy and cost. Sacrifice is clearly an expenditure of resources, physical energy, emotional energy, time, wealth. You can use metaphors from thermodynamics, energy transfer, cost, efficiency, conservation to think about the investment of sacrifice and the potential return or waste. Georges Bataille's idea of wasteful expenditure and sacrifice kind of resonates here.
Okay, I can sort of see that. What else?
Equilibrium and trade-offs. Physical systems tend towards equilibrium. Sacrifice often involves trade-offs, self versus other, short-term versus long-term, maybe aiming for a new state of balance or stability, like relational harmony or social order. Game theory also talks about equilibrium states.
Fields, like gravity.
As a metaphor, yes. You could think of social influence, group norms, the pull of collective identity that motivates sacrifice as being analogous to a physical field exerting force.
Order versus disorder.
Entropy. Another potential analogy. Sacrifice is often aimed at restoring or maintaining order, social or cosmic. This could be metaphorically contrasted with physical entropy, the tendency towards disorder. Though, again, some might see certain wasteful sacrifices as contributing to a kind of social entropy.
And sacrifice itself can be a metaphor.
Absolutely. We talk about sacrificing the ego for spiritual growth or dying to self in relationships. These metaphors reveal our underlying assumptions about the self, value, and what constitutes a fulfilling life.
So these abstract frameworks offer different perspectives. Decision game theory helps with strategic choices. Logic helps with rationality and paradoxes. Physics offers metaphors for dynamics and costs.
Right. But again, the huge caveat is that they can't capture the full picture, the emotion, the meaning, the context, the history, the biology. There's always a risk of reductionism, of oversimplifying the human reality.
But highlighting those logical paradoxes, like the self-obligation one, seems useful for thinking about the ethics of it all.
I agree. It connects directly to the ethical evaluation of limits, whether we have duties to ourselves that might make certain sacrifices morally problematic.
Which brings us squarely into the ethics of sacrifice. This feels like the really crucial part, in a way. How do we judge whether a sacrifice is right or wrong?
Yeah, this is where ethical philosophy comes in, trying to provide frameworks for evaluating the morality of sacrifice. Is it right, wrong, obligatory, just permissible, maybe even praiseworthy, and as you'd expect, different theories offer very different answers.
Let's walk through some of the main ones. Consequentialism, focusing on the outcome.
Right. Consequentialism, in its broadest sense, says the morality of an action depends entirely on its consequences. Utilitarianism is the most famous version. The right action is the one that produces the greatest overall good, usually defined as happiness, well-being, or preference satisfaction for the greatest number of people involved.
So a sacrifice is justified if it leads to the best overall results.
From a utilitarian perspective, yes. The classic trolley problem scenarios are designed to push this logic. Is it right to sacrifice one person to save 5? Utilitarianism often suggests yes, if that maximizes overall well-being.
What are the problems with that view?
Well, critics argue it can justify actions that seem intuitively wrong, like sacrificing an innocent person for the greater good. It can also be incredibly demanding, potentially requiring huge personal sacrifices if that maximizes overall utility. And practically, predicting all the consequences of an action is often impossible.
Okay, what's the alternative? Deontology. Rules and duties.
Exactly. Deontology focuses on duties, rules, rights, and obligations, which are seen as having moral weight independent of the consequences. Actions are judged based on whether they conform to moral principles or respect fundamental rights.
Like Kant's categorical imperative.
That's the prime example. Act only according to principles you could will to be universal laws, and always treat humanity, whether in yourself or others, as an end in itself, never merely as a means.
How does that apply to sacrifice?
Well, sacrifice might be a duty in some specific roles, like a soldier's duty, perhaps, or a parent's duty to care for a child. But deontology would generally prohibit sacrificing one person, using them as a mere means, even to achieve a good outcome for others, because that violates the principle of treating persons as ends in themselves.
What are the criticisms here?
Deontology can seem rigid, sometimes forbidding actions that would clearly have good consequences, and it can be difficult to resolve situations where different duties seem to conflict.
And the third approach, virtue ethics.
Virtue ethics shifts the focus away from actions or rules and onto the moral character of the person acting. It asks, what would a virtuous person do in this situation?
Virtuous meaning.
Someone possessing virtues like courage, honesty, compassion, justice, temperance, generosity. The goal is eudaimonia, often translated as human flourishing or living well. The right action is what a virtuous person would characteristically do as part of a flourishing life.
So how does virtue ethics evaluate sacrifice?
It looks at the character expressed by the act and how it contributes to the flourishing of everyone involved. Is the sacrifice an act of courage, generosity, or loyalty? Or is it reckless, foolhardy, maybe self-abasing, or done from a place of vice? Aristotle's idea of the golden mean, finding the right balance between extremes, is often relevant here. Courage is a virtue, but rashness and cowardice are vices.
Downsides to this approach.
It can sometimes seem less clear in providing concrete guidance for specific actions compared to rules-based or consequence-based theories, and how virtues are developed is complex and influenced by upbringing and society.
And then underlying a lot of this is the egoism versus altruism debate again.
Right. Psychological egoism claims we are always ultimately self-interested, making true altruistic sacrifice impossible. Ethical egoism claims we should be self-interested, making sacrifice for others immoral unless it serves our own ends.
And altruism as an ethical stance says
that we do have moral obligations to others, or that acting for others' benefit, even at a cost to ourselves, is virtuous. This is the basis for much traditional morality and religious ethics.
What about Ayn Rand's view? She had strong opinions on this.
Very strong. Objectivism rejects altruism, defining it as self-sacrifice to others, which Rand considered evil, and also rejects predatory egoism, the sacrifice of others. She argued sacrifice, defined as giving up a higher value for a lower one, is inherently irrational and immoral. Instead, she advocated rational self-interest pursued through voluntary exchange, the trader principle. Helping others without self-sacrifice could be generosity, but never a duty.
Wow. So whether a sacrifice is morally justified really hinges on which ethical framework you adopt.
Absolutely. The factors considered: consequences, duties, rights, character, intentions, consent, especially if sacrificing others, context, all get weighed differently.
And is major sacrifice ever required? An obligation, or is it always above and beyond?
That's the question of obligation versus supererogation. Utilitarianism can be very demanding, potentially obligating significant sacrifice. Deontology identifies specific duties that might involve risk or cost. Virtue ethics sees virtuous actions, including sacrifice, as part of flourishing, perhaps less as a strict list of obligations. Common sense morality often treats extreme self-sacrifice as heroic, supererogatory, praiseworthy, but not required, although, again, some roles, like military service, might carry obligations involving the risk of sacrifice.
And there's a big difference between sacrificing yourself and sacrificing someone else, ethically speaking.
A huge difference. Self-sacrifice is often permissible, sometimes admired. Sacrificing others without their informed consent is almost universally condemned as morally impermissible, outside of those extreme, highly contested, lesser evil scenarios like the trolley problem.
We see these dilemmas play out in crises too, right? Like
Yeah.
pandemics.
Definitely. Pandemics force incredibly difficult ethical trade-offs, often pitting individual liberties against public health. Restricting movement, mandating masks, requiring vaccinations. These can be seen as sacrifices of personal freedom for the collective good, especially to protect the vulnerable.
How do we justify those ethically?
It requires a very careful balancing of values, liberty versus safety, individual rights versus collective well-being, principles of justice, fair distribution of burdens. Transparency in decision-making and accountability are crucial. Sometimes framing these measures as part of a temporary ethic of sacrifice can help emphasize solidarity and the value we place on each life.
Finally, what about the personal cost? The impact of sacrifice on the well-being of the person making the sacrifice.
This is where psychology and ethics really intersect. We know that chronic self-sacrifice, especially if it's avoidance-motivated, lacks reciprocity, or feels inauthentic or coerced, is linked to negative outcomes.
Like burnout.
Burnout, emotional exhaustion, chronic stress, resentment, loss of identity, relationship conflict, potentially depression and anxiety, even physical health issues. If giving becomes a constant drain without replenishment or positive meaning, it clearly undermines well-being. And some research suggests women might experience these pressures more intensely in certain social contexts.
But there can be positive impacts too.
Yes, definitely. As we discussed, a willingness to sacrifice, especially when approach-motivated, done out of love, for intimacy, to benefit a partner, to live up to values, is often linked to higher relationship satisfaction and stability for both partners.
So the motivation is key.
It seems to be crucial. Approach-motivated sacrifice correlates with positive emotions, life satisfaction, relationship quality, authenticity, a sense of fulfillment. It builds intimacy and trust. And receiving that kind of sacrifice also increases the recipient's satisfaction. More broadly, giving and sacrificing for causes or people we care about is often central to finding meaning in life. Pro-social spending research shows giving to others can boost happiness. Focusing on the gains, not just the losses, seems important.
So it's a really complex ethical picture. Depends on your philosophical starting point.
It does. Ethical pluralism means judging requires clarifying your assumptions. A utilitarian might approve what a deontologist forbids, while a virtue ethicist looks at the character involved.
And the psychological impact, the effect on well-being, should surely inform the ethics.
I think it has to. An ethical system that leads to widespread burnout and misery probably isn't conducive to human flourishing, which is central to virtue ethics, and even consequentialism needs to factor in long-term psychological costs. The quality and motivation of the sacrifice matter immensely. We need that interplay between psychology and ethics for a nuanced assessment that considers lived experience, not just abstract principles.
Okay, so as we wrap up this really deep dive, what are the main takeaways? We've seen sacrifice as this incredibly fundamental, multifaceted thing.
Absolutely. It seems universally present across human history and cultures in all these diverse forms, tangible and intangible.
Driven by this really complex web of motivations, religious, social, psychological, even evolutionary roots.
And subject to all these different ethical interpretations depending on how you look at it.
And that interplay between the domains is fascinating, isn't it? How evolution might shape our psychology, which then gets expressed and regulated through culture and beliefs, and then judged by our ethical systems.
It's a constant dynamic interaction.
So what about that big question we raised at the start? Is sacrifice necessary? Is it an inescapable part of being human?
Well, if we take the broad definition, relinquishing something of value for a perceived higher purpose or goal, then arguably, yes, it seems largely unavoidable, maybe even essential for a meaningful life.
How so?
Our ability to make choices often involves sacrificing alternatives. Cooperation depends on sometimes sacrificing immediate self-interest for mutual benefit or group goals. Building deep relationships requires compromise and investing time and energy sacrificing other things. It's how we signal commitment.
But the really destructive forms, non-consensual human sacrifice, harmful asceticism, those self-negating patterns we talked about, those aren't inevitable.
No, absolutely not. Those specific harmful manifestations are culturally constructed, ethically evaluated, and importantly, things we can and often have worked to mitigate or eliminate as societies evolve their values and understanding.
So the goal should be to promote the positive forms of sacrifice.
Exactly. Encourage sacrifice that is voluntary, feels authentic, is approach motivated, aiming for positive outcomes, and ideally contributes to mutual flourishing.
And at the same time, mitigate the negative.
Yes, by challenging harmful social norms, helping people establish healthy boundaries, fostering environments where choices can be made freely and consciously, and it requires ongoing ethical reflection, constantly thinking about that balance between self and other, respecting rights, considering the collective good.
Ultimately, sacrifice seems just inextricably tied to what we value as humans, doesn't it?
It really does. What we are willing to give up often reveals what we hold most dear, our gods, our communities, our loved ones, our ideals, our hopes for the future. It signifies a level of commitment that goes beyond just immediate self-gratification.
It reflects our interdependence, our
Yep.
capacity for altruism.
Yes, and our constant negotiation between our own needs and the needs of others. And that ongoing quest for meaning, for connection, maybe even for transcendence. And across all its forms, that function as a powerful signal seems persistent.
Signaling devotion, appeasement, fitness, cooperation, care, commitment, need, status, all sorts of things.
Exactly. It's a unifying way to think about its diverse functions. The specific forms and justifications will surely keep evolving, but that fundamental human capacity to value things beyond our immediate selves and to act on that valuation, even at a cost, that seems likely to remain a defining, complex, and often challenging part of who we are.
So the task is to understand its power and try to shape it towards human dignity and flourishing.
That seems like the critical challenge, yes.
Considering all of this, what do you think is the most profound sacrifice an individual can make, and why? It's definitely something for you to really ponder on your own.
This is DigitView.